it's a treat to not only be with you, but to get to write books and then to get to talk about them with people who are interested and curious about books. So um, thank you so much, Allison, for that warm introduction, that great review of my background, and a forward look at some of my work. I write narrative nonfiction books. These are books based on big moments in history and science, big people who had transformative impacts, largely that you've never heard of. And that's what I try to find: big moments of tension and conflict and transformation, and draw them into big stories that read like they're made up. They're all researched, heavily researched, and true. So with that, I'm going to share my screen here. And we'll turn to my latest book, which came out just last month, and it's called American Poison. It's the story of an unsung woman of history, who is this woman, Alice Hamilton. Alice Hamilton was a transformative pioneer in her era, and I'll explain a little bit why, but she's really our hero. And I describe her often as the Erin Brockovich of the 1920s for what she did, the changes she made, and the battles that she fought. But I'll start a little bit earlier. This story really starts in the 1920s. The 20s were a very pivotal era, a very exciting era, a time of growth, a time of growth and almost explosive growth in every industry. There were uh, growth in culture and innovation, in fashion, in dance, and aviation. I mean, everything that sort of happened at once. And I think of it a lot like today, where it feels like things are growing and innovation is happening really fast and all at once. So this was the era really that is pivotal to this moment, and why Alice Hamilton became this person. I will say the biggest growth area in the US in the 1920s was actually centered where you all are, in Ohio, and it was cars. As you all know, the auto industry was based in Ohio before it moved up to Michigan, and the 20s were this kind of exciting time where cars got big. Cars were not invented in the 20s, they were several decades prior, but it was really the 1920s when things really hit their stride. When more people could afford cars, they were on every road. And as I researched, I sort of got into this obsession of finding photos of 1920s traffic. I loved that. I thought it was so interesting to find these old photos that really demonstrate how chaotic it was in the 1920s with all of this technology happening so fast. No one really knew how roads should behave. And here's another photo that, shows people walking, horses, horse carriages, cable cars, regular cars, all trying to use the same space with no apparent system of organization. And here's one final one. The earliest stoplights here, and cars trying to move in the same direction. And this embodied that spirit that things were happening. They were happening fast, and probably faster than most people were comfortable with, but it was exciting. It was really, really exciting. This effect of the Industrial Revolution was the world that Alice Hamilton grew up in and became a woman in. She was born just after the Civil War in Indiana and Fort Wayne. She was born to a very wealthy family that had a mansion that occupied an entire city block. But from an early age, she had this calling that she didn't just want to be a rich girl, a rich person who enjoyed the lavishness of luxury. She wanted to be useful and be helpful. So she started by going into medicine. She got her medical degree. And by the time she was about 20, she wanted to do more. She wanted to help people. And at the time, this sort of work didn't really exist in a formal way, but it was happening in a big way in Chicago. And it drew her to this place, which maybe some of you there in Ohio have even seen, heard of. This is Hull House in Chicago, founded by the famous Jane Addams as what she called a bridge between the classes, a place where all sorts of people of different classes, different races, nationalities, origins could come together for what we now would call social work, right? People who were marginalized, maybe immigrants who had just come to America, who didn't really have any political power. They had no economic power. They didn't speak English. They needed help getting jobs. They'd go to a place like Hull House, where there would be young people who would basically volunteer to help them learn to speak English, learn a different language, learn to do basic math, maybe help doing their taxes, all sorts of these things that didn't really exist in a social support way. So Alice Hamilton goes to Hull House in the spirit of trying to do something to be helpful. And she was not a young kid at the time. She was a young woman and she was a doctor, right? She was an established person who took this unconventional path because she felt called to it. And at Hull House, she immediately gets called into work. She gets called to help people find jobs, to help people learn how to vote. When there's an injustice in the neighborhood, she helped organize people for a protest. But most often, because she was a doctor, she spent her time in what was called the Well Baby Clinic. And here's a photo of the clinic in those days. Most of the work was giving babies baths. So I don't know who took this photo. I love this photo. My wife loves this photo. But really, at a time when, most working parents could not even give their kids baths, this was the work of Alice Hamilton. She also did other work with kids, and especially when they got sick. And so it usually went like this. A kid would get sick in their house, and they'd call Alice Hamilton to their house. And she would go, with her tools, her stethoscope, and she would, diagnose the baby with maybe a lung condition or a respiratory condition, whatnot. And usually what would happen is in the next room, she'd hear someone else sick, usually the father, who was like coughing really, really hard, or maybe moaning from like a deep stomach pain. And then she'd often go treat him and figure out what was wrong with him. And over time, she did this enough. She'd go treat kids and then sort of spill over onto their father's ailing conditions. And she started to notice patterns, right? The men who all had the same sounding cough all worked in the same factory, in the factory that, had dealt with maybe a toxic chemical. All the men who had what they called wrist palsy or wrist drop all worked together in a different factory. The men who had lost feelings in their hands or who had gone blind prematurely, they all seemed to be in these clusters together. And so she did what we now call epidemiology. Back then, it was just shoe leather epidemiology. She'd literally go door to door to piece together these patterns and try to connect the source to the effect, right? What were these men working with and what did it do to them? And once she had that material, that knowledge, she would go to the factory owner or the factory boss and lobby them to improve, maybe buy uniforms or gloves or masks or better working conditions in ways that could protect their workers. And it was all very basic the way we think of it today. Of course, wear a mask if you work with toxic chemicals. But at the time, there wasn't really a culture of protecting your workers. This was a time of American growth where it was considered almost expendable that an immigrant who didn't speak English didn't really need protections at work, right? Obviously, we have laws that protect this now, but at the time, it just sort of worked on this like pressure system. And Alice Hamilton was not only an activist and an advocate, but she was a scientist. And she was trying to make the scientific case that we could protect workers, usually with not that much more effort. She got really good at this. She got really good at connecting health conditions to what was causing them. And it was almost always related to the American industrial machine. These factories, these mines, smelters, where men's lives were expendable because they were under pressure to produce. America was growing faster every day. There was demand for materials and output, consumable products every day. And stopping to to look at how they were made, or who was maybe marginalized in the process, or affected, or sickened, was not really kind of a question people asked. So this was the mantle that Alice Hamilton picked up, really to try to make the case that we should care about these things. And here's the medical case to prove it. So she did this with all sorts of materials. She did it in factories that made clothing. She did it in factories that made building materials and steel, mercury, any kind of toxic chemical at the time. She did a study and investigation of. She was so good at this that in 1910, the governor of Illinois asked her to do a statewide investigation of lead. And lead was interesting. She loved lead. She loved researching lead because it was so profoundly toxic. And it wasn't a secret that it was toxic. Lead was a known poison for centuries. As far back as the Roman Empire, even earlier, people knew something was up with lead. The way it made people act, the way it made people behave, the way it led to neurological effects. It wasn't a mystery that lead was poisonous. And it's a very, very kind of thick bone of contention over whether lead poisoning is connected to the fall of the Roman Empire. This is a topic that historians debate constantly, but the Romans' use of lead in their aqueducts, in their food, in their plumbing, in their face powders, almost everything is connected with sort of the fall of the empire. Alice Hamilton knew this, but there were still dozens of factories around Chicago and Illinois that were making lead for any conceivable product, especially pipes and paint. And I'll add that pipes, lead pipes, really the word plumbing that we know now as what plumbing is, comes from the word in Latin for lead, plumbum. So lead and pipes were sort of connected in their origin. There was this American engine of producing more and more lead over time, and Alice Hamilton went factory to factory to try to protect the workers doing it. Now, this was effective, and she was effective in protecting men's lives, but there was another industry that was producing even more lead constantly. And so here's where we come to cars and to Ohio. So cars, of course, were not new in the 20s, but this was their kind of big growth spurt. And cars had this problem that we call engine knock. And maybe some of you have heard of engine knock. We still have engine knock today, but back then every car had it. And it was especially bad when you tried to sort of go at a high speed or maybe drive up a hill. And the problem was that here's an engine, internal combustion engine from a car. Problem up here was the fuel would come in from the spark plugs, the fuel lines, and it would sort of combust in the cylinder prematurely. It just didn't quite work. So it caused this clanging sound that announced to everyone on the street that you had engine knock. And what it amounted to was that cars had reached a maximum point. You couldn't go any faster. You couldn't make a car any more powerful because the fuel couldn't combust at a high enough octane. We know octane today as the sort of number that is correlated with a car's power, a fuel's power. And so engine knock was a major problem in those days, and one that everyone wanted to solve. And the engineer or the chemist who solved it would be very richly rewarded. And so here's where we meet Thomas Midgley. Thomas Midgley was a chemist. He was a mechanical engineer. He worked for General Motors. He started there in 1919, and he really took on the challenge of finding a way around engine knock. And this was a big chemical problem. Gasoline existed, it was powerful, but it wasn't powerful enough. What chemical could he add to gasoline to make it even more powerful? And so he undergoes this sort of hunt and peck research quest. And Midgley goes to work in his lab, testing chemical after chemical in a test engine. And here he is at his test engine, trying to find a better additive for gasoline. And this was really a search of the periodic table. And so here's the periodic table that Midgley looked at. This is what it looked at like in those days. There were only about, I think, 60 or maybe 65 known elements in that day. We've added a lot more since, especially with synthetic chemistry. But back then, he'd look at every single element here, and he would try to figure out which could be added. And so he'd start with each of them that he could access. And some, improved engine knock a little, some didn't. Some were hard to get, some didn't. And ultimately, it took him 3 years, but he centered his search down here in this bottom corner of the periodic table in his pocket. He looked at selenium, which helped. He looked at tin, which helped a little more. And eventually his eyes got drawn to, again, PB, plumbum, lead. And so lead, when he puts it into the test engine, not only cures engine knock, but he reduces the amount of lead every test until he gets to the minimum amount that's needed for a gallon of gasoline. And it's just a couple drops of lead per gallon of gasoline cures engine knock. This is a major discovery. It's a major finding, and a very lucrative one too, because Midgley had calculated, with the support of his very excited bosses, that whoever figured out this puzzle could patent the solution, and that patent would be worth a small royalty on every gallon of gasoline sold in the US. That, of course, amounted to hundreds of millions of dollars to whoever did it. So Midgley was, of course, very excited. Here's Alice Hamilton on the left and Thomas Midgley on the right. And almost as soon as Midgley and General Motors announced that their discovery of their type of lead, tetraethyl lead it was called, added to gasoline, was an engine knock cure, Alice Hamilton wrote to Midgley and said, this is a terrible idea. Again, we have known since the Roman Empire that lead in almost any form is dangerous, damaging, and in some cases deadly. Think of something else. Do something else. Find another solution. And Midgley, of course, is very drawn to that royalty, right? This is a very lucrative discovery that he was very excited to talk about and wasn't willing to let go. And so in 1923, ethyl gasoline, as it was called, for tetraethyl leaded gasoline, goes on sale in Ohio. And it was a major debut. And I think of this similar to almost the release of like the iPhone today, right? Something that was exciting, that was new, technologic progress, that was, something major that everyone wanted to get behind. And this was a debut of a technology. It was the release of a new product. And it really was the new day in cars that could sort of outrun this technological constraint of knock. But there was a problem, and it had to do with exactly what Alice Hamilton warned about. Lead was poisonous. It was so poisonous, in fact, that Thomas Midgley, here he is again, got lead poisoning himself. And in the winter of 1923, 1924, he goes down to Florida to convalesce because he has such high lead exposure. And normally to any of us, we would say, well, if even the guy who invented it gets poisoned, that's not a great sign. But Midgley had a different view. He thought of it like he was a firefighter. Like, of course, I work in burning buildings. Of course, I'm going to be the one who gets burned first, right? Of course, I work with high concentrations of lead in my lab. Of course, I'm going to get exposed and poisoned. But most other people will not have nearly the same level of exposure as me. So not to worry. And this was a compelling rationale, or at least it explained away his own lead poisoning. But in the fall of 1924, something big happens, big problem. And it occurs in a manufacturing plant just across the river from New York City in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And some of the workers start to feel funny, start to feel really funny, need to go home sick, can't make it all the way home, vomiting, terrors, shaking what they called then insanity, violent insanity. All four of these men died within 24 hours, and nobody knew what caused it. And because it was a mystery, it created this whole media storm in New York City, which was just next door, the biggest media capital of America, of what was this dangerous thing that they were working with. And here's some headlines. Loony gas causes death of one man, 3 others crazy. 3rd man dies of poison gas. Probe cases of gas crazed men in New Jersey. This was a major story, it was a major problem, and it really concerned the public, right? What were these men working with, and can I be next? They called it loony gas, which was unfortunate in some ways because gas, in this sense, referred to the gas in the factory they were working with. But gas, as we know, is also the term we use for gasoline. So nobody knew if the material they were working with was actually the same material that was in gasoline across the country, and anyone else could get poisoned. Any motorist on any street corner could have the same effects of these men. Now, naturally, as Alice Hamilton is fighting against this, Thomas Midgley fights back. He hires a PR agent, the PR kind of maven of that era, a man named Ivy Lee, who invented crisis public relations. And Midgley goes through this very elaborate demonstration to prove that leaded gasoline is not poisonous, that tetraethyl lead is totally harmless. And he puts his fingers in a vial or in a beaker of tetraethyl lead. He smells it. Again, this is a man who recently recovered from lead poisoning. Eventually, Alice Hamilton enlists a friend. Down here on the bottom left, this is Walter Lippmann, who at the time ran part of the New York World. It was one of the most influential papers of New York at the time. And both of them, Hamilton and Lippmann, believed that a media crusade, as they called it, was the only thing that could dislodge ethyl gasoline from the marketplace, right? Shame it into obscurity. Midgley here on the bottom right is joined by his boss here on the top right. This is Charles Kettering. And Kettering and Midgley, of course, still believe in their product. They still believe in its ability. And they, of course, believe in its lucrative capacity. So, this product can still make them millions of dollars. They weren't willing to let it go. And to explain away that crisis in the factory in New Jersey, they blamed it on the workers. They said, these are men who don't know what they're doing. They weren't properly trained. They weren't wearing the right clothes and equipment. Some of them couldn't speak English. They did what is still a common theme in American history. You blame the victim and the workers for the fault or negligence at the very top of the company. And it did go in this case to the top of the company. This man here, well, here we have Midgley, his boss, Kettering, and Kettering's boss, Alfred P. Sloan, who was the CEO of General Motors. And so this creates, again, this media war of these 3 men with their high-priced public relations fighting against Alice Hamilton and her ally, Walter Lippmann, in media. And eventually this debate gets so big, so loud, it kind of blankets the nation in warring editorials and letters and studies that it goes to the government. And the government sort of has to decide, is leaded gasoline a problem or isn't it? And the Public Health Service, which is a division of the federal government, this was their home. This was the site of the Public Health Service in Washington, D.C., just across the street from the Capitol. In May of 1925, almost exactly 100 years ago, next month, it'll be 100 years, hosts a conference in this building in Washington. And the Surgeon General, who's the head of the Public Health Service, invites what he calls all sides of this discussion to this conference. And Alice Hamilton is there, Walter Lippmann, Alfred P. Sloan, Charles Kettering, and Thomas Midgley. Everyone's in the room with about 80 other people to sort of duke it out. And the whole theory of the day is that everyone will present their ideas and the best ones will rise to the top and will get a conclusion. But as we could see now, this conference was very stacked, right? The industry had a very good friend in the Surgeon General who sort of arranged the conference in a way that favored Ethel Corporation and General Motors. It gave them the entire morning to speak and present their case. It allowed them to rebut anyone who countered them. And it really kind of let them steamroll their industry spin over the whole conference. So even though Alice Hamilton was there and many of her colleagues from Harvard and Yale and other universities, they weren't really heard. They weren't really listened to. And as this conference concludes and an independent study is commissioned, the study itself is sort of weakened and diluted very systematically to point to ethyl gasoline being totally safe. And within a year of this conference and this conclusion that there's no grounds for banning ethyl gasoline, ethyl leaded gasoline is on its way across America. It has blanketed the market. And these are just some ads that I found in magazines that show, just how ubiquitous this was. And I love some of these old magazine ads. G-pop, they're all passing you. You need to use ethyl. Or this one, what a powerful difference this high octane gasoline makes. Here it's this man, taming this elephant. Ethyl controls the giant power of gasoline. And then there's this one on the right. This is my favorite. These women who look like they're just having such a great time in this high-powered, high-octane car. What a powerful difference this high-octane gasoline makes. And so the issue was settled. And in the 1920s, by 1926, ethyl gasoline was on its way to market dominance. Those royalties, those 3 to 4 cent royalties on every gallon were rolling in. Ethyl was making a lot of money, and the scientific opposition had really been silenced, vanquished. So it was no longer really an issue of debate. And Alice Hamilton recognized that she lost. She moved on to other fights. She continued researching and inspecting factories and mines. She went overseas. She was asked by foreign governments to do the same work. But leaded gasoline, she let go. Now we're going to jump forward here about 20 years into the 1950s when this story has another chapter. And this here is a man at Caltech. His name was Claire Patterson, a very famous geologist. And he was famous because he was the man who wanted to find the age of the Earth. And Claire Patterson undergoes a very elaborate process to find the age of the Earth, but it's a very chemical molecular process. And every reading he tried to get of different rocks, he found that it was too noisy, that there was too much lead in his readings. And he didn't know why. And eventually he cleaned his lab very elaborately. He, changed the plumbing and the gaskets in the windows. He prevented people from wearing their shoes and then any of their clothes. And they had to wear these big suits. And it was still too noisy. And he said, there's so much lead in the air everywhere. Where is it coming from? He went to the northeast when he took samples from the ocean, and he found out that there was more lead in the upper layers of the ocean than the lower, which to him signaled that it was new and it was coming from somewhere. He went to Antarctica and he went to the Arctic and he took ice cores where he could see layer by layer of snow which year had more lead. And it all started at a specific point in 1923. So Claire Patterson is really the person that discovered lead was everywhere on Earth, and it had infiltrated every square inch of the planet, even the remote poles. Now, this was a big finding. He got very much attacked by the industry for this revelation and this finding, this scientific series of studies. But he didn't really know what effect it had on people. No one did. And he wasn't a doctor, but this man was. And this man here, his name was Herb Needleman. He was a pediatrician in Philadelphia. And Herb Needleman started to notice that some of his patients were lethargic, very low energy. and he couldn't figure out why. And he started to think about how he could test their lead levels. Lead was kind of known to lead to this, like, loss of neurological vibrance. And he started to figure out a system that he could extract not bone biopsies, but baby teeth. And so he collected teeth from kids all over Philadelphia and tried to link together what effect it was having. And what he found was really striking. And he published a lot of studies too. Basically, the closer a child lived to a busy road, the higher his blood lead levels. The further inside of a city a child lived, the higher he was in lead. And what effect did that have? He was more likely to drop out of school early. He was more likely to have bad behavior in school. He was more likely to have lower test scores. And of course, also the era's fashionable sort of measure for intelligence was IQ. And so high lead and high lead exposure was correlated to low IQs. And more researchers dug into this. And here's a chart that I made for my book that sort of shows this remarkable correlation. And nobody knows if these things cause each other. But what this chart shows is that here's, the dark black line is lead, gas, and paint use. And you could see how it goes up over time, sort of slinks down here during World War II, up again, and then down again and up and grows, is correlated very closely with homicides, rates of homicides as they go up and down. Now, interestingly, these two lines are about 20 years apart, 21 years. And the reason this is significant is that children who were exposed maybe to high levels of lead at various points from gas and paint, when they became adults 21 years later, were more likely to become violent criminals. And so this was a theory, it remains one, and it's known as the lead crime hypothesis. It will always be a hypothesis. It's very impossible to prove. But what's really interesting here is the decline. So as lead gas and lead paint start to be outlawed in the 1970s, crime starts to drop also. And we don't really have the data all the way sort of to show as far as it continues to go down. For those of you who were alive in the 90s, you might remember crime started to drop a lot, to the point where mayors of big cities, I'm thinking of Rudy Giuliani, start to claim that they had cleaned up cities. And we don't know exactly if public policy had an effect or what else was in effect. But people in the who subscribe and really have researched the lead crime hypothesis believe that the outlawing of lead gasoline and lead paint in the 1970s had a dramatic effect 20 years later in the 1990s when crime started to drop. Now, we still have big lead problems in our country today. It's still a major problem. Half of US children have lead. We had my 1-year-old son tested recently. He had very low levels, but he did not have zero. So just living in the world, a child now accumulates lead in their blood and in their bones because of leaded gasoline that was burned half a century ago. 1 in 3 children worldwide have lead poisoning, especially in developing countries. Here's a map showing some of the worst lead infected places in the country. And you'll notice, those of you in Ohio, that this corridor here, where cars were especially big, where most of the population lived in the early 20th century, has some of the highest levels of lead in soil and air and water. A lot of that is residual from leaded gasoline that was burned up through the 1970s. Alice Hamilton called it, right? She knew this. She knew it in 1919. She knew it in 1923 when leaded gasoline started to be sold. She tried to scream about it in 1925 at this conference that this was a problem. And here's this great quote that she had. Every article I wrote in those days, every speech I made is full of pleading for the recognition of lead poisoning as a real and serious medical problem. Now, as I mentioned, eventually the science really caught up and public opinion caught up, and we outlawed leaded gasoline in the 1970s. There was actually a major innovation in cars that outlawed it even before the government could. But we outlawed it finally, and Alice Hamilton got that historic vindication that she really deserved at the time. Amazingly, the world used leaded gasoline until just 4 years ago. We used it abroad and overseas, and especially in developing countries. In 2021, Algeria became the last country to use it. This is in many ways a depressing and a shocking story. And I was very depressed as I was researching it, thinking, oh my God, this was all preventable. Someone knew at the time and was trying to warn everybody else, and she couldn't break through at that time. But I've also found this story to be a story of inspiration. That people lived in a world in the 1920s that was growing too fast, where industry maybe had a little too much power, wealth was concentrated in too few people's hands. And here was the example of Alice Hamilton. This is a park in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where one of the very few Alice Hamilton sort of legacy pieces still sits. It's a series of sculptures of her and her sisters. Alice Hamilton did not become famous. She did not leave a illustrious legacy of, her name on buildings or endowed scholarships. She never really sought out fame. But we could look at her example as the quiet work of someone who made the world dramatically better. And I think of Alice Hamilton as someone who really teaches us that one person or a group of people can do a lot of damage to the world, and sometimes very quickly. But the opposite is also true, that a tireless, devoted, persistent, tenacious woman can keep doing the work and keep demonstrating what she knows is true. And it took 100 years from 1921 until 2021 for leaded gasoline to run its course. But in another sense, it took only 100 years for an entire cycle of environmental destruction and improvement to occur. And I believe the same is true for those of us who fight for a planet in balance, for clean cities and natural resources, for economic and environmental justice and equity for all people. These fights take a long time. They are inches, and sometimes we go backwards. But Alice Hamilton is proof that the tide does change. So with that, I will stop here, and I will be very, very happy to take some questions. Let's see. Look in the chat.
So if you have any questions for the author, you can put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen.
While we wait, I will answer the question I get most often, which maybe some of you are thinking, which is what drew me to Alice Hamilton and researching her so deeply. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I very strongly look for powerful, impactful, unsung people who explain or embody an era or a movement or a change of history that we haven't heard about. And as a historian, it's very easy to see that most of history centers around a few kind of major nuclei. People like, Teddy Roosevelt or Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison, these major difference makers. But the world is full of people like Alice Hamilton who did the hard work, never drew major attention to herself, but still transformed the world. And so I love characters like that. I loved getting to know her, reading all of her letters and her diaries, her journals, her scientific reports. An enormous amount of material that show just enliven what her era was like and her work was like.
Yeah, I was reading a little bit just about her her background, and I was reading that she didn't actually go to school. She was homeschooled by her parents. And when she applied to go to college, she really had to like bump up her science background because she always shied away from taking math and science classes.
Yeah, as I mentioned, she grew up in a really wealthy family, and her father was kind of very eccentric, and he believed that all education was rooted in languages, that all you had to do was learn languages. And then you could use that knowledge to read books. You could read books in every language you needed, every language you knew, and learn everything that way. You didn't really need fancy education. So she never got it until she went off to boarding school as an older woman in Connecticut. And that's where she sort of finds her footing. But yeah, it was uncommon at the time for a woman to go to school, for a woman to go to medical school, to become a doctor, um, and take the path she did. So she was unconventional in those ways. And I will also add, it was unconventional that she never got married. This was a very unconventional thing for a woman to basically be single all her life. She was mocked for it. She was teased. She was constantly asked about what kind of husband she was looking for. And she always sort of had the sense that men weren't really worth the trouble, that she could get further on her own. She wouldn't be dragged down. She wouldn't be, of course, demanded to do all sorts of domestic drudgery when she would rather be doing her science and medical work.
Yeah, and I read she lived to 101.
Yeah, which is remarkable. Thomas Midgley, I won't mention here his ending, but I will say it's a very rich and vivid story in the
Mhm.
book. He worked with toxic chemicals all his career and paid the price ultimately. Alice Hamilton was also in all of these mines and smelter. I mean, everywhere that you would be exposed to toxic chemicals, and she still lived to 101. She died in 1970 and was honored by President Nixon just a couple months before she died for founding what we think of now as environmentalism. She was an early environmentalist. She is also considered the founding mother of what we now call OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It's amazing that before the 1970s, we didn't really have major workplace protections, and we
Yeah,
do now because of Alice Hamilton.
yeah. Well, we do have some questions now for the author. If you want to, if you can see in the Q&A.
Let's see. I will look in the chat. I don't see any. Can you read them, Allison?
Yeah, in the Q, they're in the Q&A, not the chat, but I can
Oh,
go
whoops.
ahead and read them here for you.
Oh.
Um, Pat asked, how hard was it to sell your book proposal? Great photos, interesting content.
Book proposals are always hard to sell. Even after, I've written a bunch of books. Publishers really want to know if you have a topic that will interest people. They don't want something too obscure. They want it to be on current themes. And even though this is a story that occurred 100 years ago, I really made the case that these themes are evergreen and they are especially relevant now, of growth, of industry dominance, of immigrant marginalization, of environmental justice, and fighting for a cleaner planet. So all of those themes coming together got it sold, and was very happy it did. Let's see, that was, let's see, D. Could you please tell a little about her personal life? Um, I assume you're talking about whether she maybe had a partner or what she did in her spare time. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, she never got married, never had a boyfriend or any partner. She never had a female partner either. So she sort of lived a life of solitude. She was very close with her sisters and her cousins. All but one of them remained single their whole lives too. So she spent a lot of her time traveling. She would travel anywhere people invited her to give talks, to do research. And eventually she bought a house with one of her sisters in Connecticut, where she spent most of her elder years and eventually died. Let's see, Tom, do you feel cell phones will be or are a future health problem? Great question. And I debate this and I discuss this in the book of what are the leaded gasolines around us today that someone is trying to warn us about, but either we're not hearing them or they're being silenced. And there are some obvious candidates. I think microplastics in a few years or decades will be revealed to be extremely damaging to broad parts of the world and our health. PFAs that are in almost kind of every industrial product too. But there are others. I think social media in maybe 10 years is gonna, there's gonna be all these findings about the disastrous effect it had on democracy, on social groups, on teenagers. Cell phones, I don't know. I really don't know. We don't have enough science yet, but eventually we will. That one is not one that deeply worries me, but I do think, just like in this story, this cycle continues to repeat, that we sort of test these products and these concepts, these innovations in real time on real people, and the profits of these innovations are privatized to the companies and their shareholders, and the costs are generally socialized to the broader, country world. So that could be the case with cell phones. I don't worry about that one. Michelle, is there any sense of how long impacts from lead emissions will still be felt? Can we use the decline in health effects after leaded gasoline ban as a model? Um, we are feeling the effects of leaded gasoline much less now than in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s after it hit the peak. But lead is still in our water, it's in our air, and it's in the soil, especially when, a big construction project sort of turns up the soil. We will be with that for centuries, long after our lives. The bigger problem, we have lead still in too many houses, too many pipes. We have leaded paint in almost every house that was built before the 1970s or the 1950s. And this is a major national problem. The Biden administration devoted about $200 to $300 million to try to study and eventually eradicate this problem. This remains a major problem, even in the house I live in right now. And I have young kids, so I worry about it too. I'm working on a fairly big story for National Geographic on exactly the remaining scourge of lead in America and around the world. Debbie, this smacks of Exxon withholding the finding their researcher knew about the effect of fossil fuel burning has on climate change. Do you agree? Yeah, I don't know the exact specifics of that case, but it is another case of a company that has an incentive to protect its product and its business model and its way of operating, despite evidence that stacks up against it. And eventually, lobbying the government to reduce, delay, or deflect any attempts at regulation. So yeah, I think this cycle occurs. Same exact thing with climate change and lots of other products. Catherine, why statues of Alice and her sisters? When were they constructed? Apparently, she was famous for a statue. Her sisters were also famous. Her sister Edith Hamilton was a classical scholar who wrote much of the research we now know about the classic Greeks. Her cousin Jessie was a teacher. I don't remember all of their jobs, but they all had these sort of fascinating public service roles. And it really reflected the way they were brought up, that you are rich, but you are expected to make yourself useful. And they all did. That's why she and her sisters got a statue. You said that she moved on at one point. What did Littman do? I might have misspelled his name. Also, what kind of MD was she? Walter Lippmann was the newspaper editor. He remained very famous and wrote books. Alice Hamilton was a toxicologist, and occupational hygienist is what we call it now. I just read about Francis Perkins. Did they know each other? Not that I know of, but I'm sure they met at some point. Let's see. How do you feel about the current federal administration dismantling the EPA and all of its environmental regulations? Very bad. I think many of us feel that we are dismantling the structures designed to keep us safe. That doesn't lead to great things. And in this story, as is today, when the government is not paying attention or doesn't take the aggressive role that it should to keep people safe, industry can really steamroll and promote products that are not safe for the public. Let's see. D, how did you first learn about her? I addressed that one about finding her in a book. I literally found Alice Hamilton in a footnote, which is very fitting for her, her legacy. I teach environmental policy to grad students, and I had never heard of her. And when I read a footnote about her doing these workplace inspections, I dug deeper and deeper and realized she was one of these characters who transformed the world, transformed an industry, and really changed the world. Yeah. Did Alice inherit any wealth from her father? No, her father was not the most agreeable man. He kind of frittered away most of the family wealth. Alice never really needed that wealth. She was very well paid for what she did. She never got rich. And I don't know exactly what happened to her entire estate, but she had no direct heirs either. So she was never making major donations or giving her money away. Allison, do we have just a couple minutes? I'm happy to.
Yeah, if you want to take like maybe one or two more.
Are there any? Can I look it back? Same power.
How about Michelle's question? Are there other historical figures that also blew the whistle on major health and scientific issues?
Yeah, I mean, we look at someone like Rachel Carson, who wrote the book Silent Spring about industrial pesticide use. Several years later, several decades later, Erin Brockovich, who we all know what she did, and hexavalent chromium in California. So there are these cases. Today, we see these same fights play out a lot of times on racial lines, that communities that are marginalized or ignored, that don't have major political power, that have poor roads, poor schools, they're food deserts, or like in Flint, Michigan, they still have lead in their water all over the city. These are fights that are extensions of the ones that Alice Hamilton started in the 19 teens and 20s. And I'll take one more.
Sure.
Yeah. Do you want to pick one, Allison?
Yeah, we just have our closing announcements on here. Let's see. Here we'll answer Laurel's. Is this a different type of lead than in lead pencils?
Yes. Tetraethyl lead was a molecular compound that ethyl groups helped the lead dissolve into gasoline, so it was evenly distributed. Lead we don't really even put in pencils, I think, anymore. Most of it is graphite, which has the same effect and same use. But still, some lead is in the world today in use in different products, and I would not suggest exposing yourself or your blood to it. If you do, a little is okay, and everyone is, has some in their body. But, I wouldn't worry about pencils.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. And Professor Stone, thank you so much for your time tonight and sharing the story of Alice Hamilton and the work that she did. Again, I'll just mention we have a link in the chat. If you'd like to purchase your copy of American Poison, we have a link in the chat for the Learned Owl bookstore. If you want to get your copy, you can just click on that link there. And
can I say, Allison,
yeah.
I just put a link in the chat also for my website. And if you'd like to be on my email newsletter or learn about my other books or another event or your book club, I love doing book clubs. That's where you could get in touch.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Have a nice evening.